What's up, parish orphans and retrogrades? Happy Monday afternoon or evening, depending wherever you are. Today, I have a special show for you on the indefectibility of all ecumenical councils, including Vatican Council II, with special guest Michael Lofton of Reason and Theology. Michael is working on a dissertation right now on the magisterium, which is why his point of view counts. He left the faith a few years back for Eastern Orthodoxy and then returned, recrossed the Tiber, and is back with us Roman Catholics, and we're happy to have him. He founded in 2019 Reason and Theology, and he is my special guest here on Rules for Retrogrades today. What's up, Michael? Happy to have you.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Timothy. How are you?
I'm excellent, man. I've been on your show a couple of times, and I have never had you on my show, and I wanted to return the favor because it's a favor for me.
Glad to be on. Honored to be here.
Recently, you did a video that sort of tagged, in some sense of the word, chewed meat, old news, but not in the full sense of the term, because it's still necessary. Folks that are based in red-pilled Catholics, that aren't normies, that aren't bougie Catholics, just going to the wheat and harvest,
right?
Boomer Novus Ordo masses and just clapping along to mass, right, blasphemously. To people like us that are, look, we're Latin Mass Catholics. It matters that folks like you, myself, my friend Chris Plants, others are out there spreading the word that the church is indefectible, and somehow this, wires got crossed somewhere along the way, and people thought that the church either could be indefectible with holy errant councils like Buzz X, or isn't indefectible, but we should still be Catholic. That sounds like the kind of reasoning that led you away temporarily. No, what can you?
Yeah, definitely. And there was a lot in what led me away. Some of them definitely had to do with misunderstanding some things that were taught by the magisterium, but especially being scandalized. I was very scandalized by a lot of the things that were going on in Catholicism. So I had a brief detour, about 3 years in Eastern Orthodoxy. But the longer I remained there, the more I saw the need for a teaching authority, because the Eastern Orthodox loosely have a teaching authority, but not something that can really be objectively identified on the universal level, beyond the synod, beyond the local bishop. For the entire universal church, there really isn't a solid objective teaching authority there. Some might say ecumenical council, but you start to look into Eastern Orthodoxy and there's really no objective way to identify them. So I begin to see the need for a teaching authority, and I saw the strengths for Rome and its claims to teaching authority, especially the papacy, but also by extension, ecumenical councils, right? Because again, this is still something that Catholicism can identify objectively, whereas other communions cannot. They might talk about ecumenical councils, but they really can't tell you what is an ecumenical council. So as I started to see the weaknesses in other communions there and the strengths for the magisterium, I realized, okay, I need to be reconciled to Rome, and especially dealing with the papacy. If the papacy is of divine institution, one cannot remain separated from it, as Vatican II itself says. A lot of people miss Lumen Gentium, and those words that I had already known continued to ring through my head, and they effectively say, you can't be saved if you refuse to enter or remain in the Catholic Church. And that last part just, if this really is of divine institution, if the papacy really is established by Christ, then I have to reconcile myself to Rome. So by continuing to study teaching authority, I made my way back into Catholicism.
Oh, God is good. God is great. That's amazing. And it's great to have you back, brother. You're on the right side of things, making the right arguments. You're citing Lumen Gentium 14.
Right, exactly.
Which, I don't know, in Latin Mass, but maybe post-traditionalist circles, whatever they're calling me in the days after Taylor Marshall and Tim Gordon show on Marshall's channel. I love the Latin Mass. I think the Latin Mass is far and away the worst thing to come from Vatican II. I'm writing a book on Vatican II, and you can get strung up in these circles for even citing Lumen Gentium 14. Of course, I'm kidding, because people don't even know that such a thornily, traditional, erstwhile document, passage exists in the document. We'll talk about that once we get things rolling. First, I just want to remind parish orphans and retrogrades out there that this is the week to understand church history better. Enroll in my church history course online. We sat 200 in our first go through in the fall into the spring. Go to timothyjgordon.com and click enroll. There are tons upon tons of testamentaries given on what people learned and how they're able to argue for the church inside the church against the people inside the church that aren't for the church anymore in 2021. You need to know church history. It's much more exciting than it sounds. It's actually true Euro history is the subtitle of the course. Go to enroll at timothyjgordon.com. Also, for the first time ever, I'm starting a Rules for Retrogrades course. It's only 10 weeks. It's a lot of fun. We're going through my book, Rules for Retrogrades, on community organizing from the right. We're just doing 4 rules a week, and it's going to be great fun. Community organizing from the right. I'll teach you not only how to win those Thanksgiving table arguments against Protestant and secularist leftists of all sort, but also more than that, I'll show you how we can get organized in a kind of right-wing Catholic American counter-Alinskyism. It's going to be great fun. Go to timothyjgordon.com and click enroll. Also, you need to get out of your blue state. I'm just saying that much. You need to get out of your blue state if you live in one. Get to a blood red state. Go to realestateforlife.org. They'll connect you with a Christian, probably a Catholic, always pro-life, who will help you to get places like Mississippi. I needed realestateforlife.org. I didn't use them because I didn't know about them back then, but I would have when I moved from California to Mississippi. Anyway, okay, so we're here having great fun today, talking to Michael Lofton about a video you did that kind of cross-referenced a lot of the scuttlebutt that was happening this time of the year last year in 2020. A lot of it had to do, at least in glancing blows, with myself, Taylor Marshall, my brother, Chris Plants, Richard DeClue. People were talking in late spring going into summer about Vatican II in a way that I'd like to think is more productive than it typically is in traditional leaning circles, because we were actually talking about the documents. One thing I learned then, Michael, is 90% of trads don't know and can't dialogue in the actual Vatican II documents that they've kind of been brainwashed into hating. Now, I'm not defending the events of the council, the personnel of the council. The left was really the muscle there. Some of the planning before, during, and after, where they were able to weaponize the ambiguity and codify the heteropraxy. But I'm just saying the documents are really, really expressly Catholic. What do you say?
Yeah, I agree. And like you, I would say that, sure, there are some things that we could criticize, but on the whole, I mean, first of all, this thing is Orthodox. We can never attribute any kind of heresy to it. Neither could we do so because, number one, factually, it did not teach heresy. And then number two, I don't even think that would be possible. I think that would then go against the indefectibility of the church. But yeah, sure, I would say that it's Orthodox. I would say those who generally criticize it do so with a hermeneutic of rupture. And that's the very hermeneutic that Benedict XVI decried in his 2005 Christmas address. And it's the very hermeneutic that the liberals tend to use. So whenever a conservative traditional Catholic uses this hermeneutic of rupture and says Vatican II departed from the faith when it taught this, they're actually having to borrow from the liberals when they do so. And I think that's very concerning. But yes, again, on the whole, I would say it's Orthodox. But of course, there's some things here and there that we could say could have been done better, especially after the fact. We can look back and say, yeah, okay, maybe this medicine of mercy approach that John the 23rd wanted to take, that he mentions there in his opening speech, didn't turn out so well. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that it has erred in its teaching authority. Right. And we have to recognize that criticism that we could level against Vatican II, that, okay, yeah, it didn't err in its teaching authority, but maybe it didn't do some things as well as it could have. You can say that about many of the other ecumenical councils.
Of course, of course. Wait, there's a couple. I probably should moonwalk a couple paces back. there's a few things I want to hit that I wanted to get in my classes, which are starting on Thursday, commercial, but except really when we're talking about folks who are tempted to go to Eastern Orthodoxy, maybe this has everything to do with the council, our most recent council, ecumenical council, and our most recent pontiff, the one in the present perfect who occupies the Vatican. I want you to speak, because you could speak with special aplomb about this temptation that, you know, in law, we'd call it an attractive nuisance. Yeah. Hanging out there. Everyone knows they don't want to go be Protestant. Sorry, Protestants, but you guys are, you know, the good spirited, you know, sort of buck-toothed little brothers at the family reunion. God bless you. I mean, you're Christian. You know, you're trying, but there's so many obvious flaws. In some ways, Protestantism is the synthesis of all heresies. Like, sorry, but you know, Eastern Orthodoxy is an attractive nuisance. It's always kind of just hanging out there. Yeah. There's a kind of cool to it because it doesn't, almost like the Jews, the Judaism of Jesus's day. They're not trying to sell themselves on anything, so that makes them look really cool from a marketing point of view. They're not really trying to evangelize much. They have the long beards and the black robes and kind of pre-Vatican II looking garb. And, you know, they have bishops, they have 7 sacraments. Their bishops are in apostolic succession. They are, depending on the way you look at it, the separated Eastern lung of the church. So in some sense, one figures, let me just jump off board, and I don't want to have to deal with the sticky Vatican II question. And I don't want to have to deal with the more than sticky Pope Francis the humble question. But here's the thing, you know, I think you and I are going to be agreeing the entire show long. So here's my one shot at maybe forging some disagreement, which I like to do. You left in 2014, 2015, 2016, something having to do with the double extraordinary and then ordinary October synods of 2014 and 2015, which led 5.5 months later to the release of Amoris Laetitia in early April 2016. As far as I know. But the thing is, Walter Casper, who introduced this plan for getting, after 30 years of trying, communion to the divorced and civilly remarried successfully now under this Sankt Gallen Mafia Pope, he was borrowing from the Eastern Orthodox plan on giving communion to the divorced and civilly remarried, right? They're allowed divorce, they're allowed contraception. So it makes no sense to jump off the bark into the sea because you're figuring that you can avoid the problems. The Eastern Orthodoxy beat us there, if we call that the Amoris Laetitia problem, right?
I mean, because two problems. Number one, you'll find that same problem again, as you're noting here, in Eastern Orthodoxy, because they've long granted the case of divorce and remarriage for a very long time. And then recently, you know, depending on which bishop you talk to, there are a few bishops that would forbid contraception, but most tend to allow contraception. But here's the plot twist. If we're going to be consistent, not only are we going to find this problem in Eastern Orthodoxy, we're also going to have to say there's some problems with Trent, because the Council of Trent itself deliberately, in the Acts of the Council of Trent, deliberately chose to pass over the issue of economia for the Eastern Orthodox bishops. So whenever it spoke about the indissolubility of marriage, some of the bishops came and said, wait, how does this deal with our Eastern brethren, our Eastern bishops who are over here in Eastern countries, and how does this deal with the Eastern Orthodox? They explicitly noted, okay, this is not going to exclude their view. It didn't endorse their view. Right. Trent did not endorse economy, but it also did not exclude them. So if we're going to criticize Amoris Laetitia, we also have to criticize Trent. I'm just saying, for us to be consistent, we need to do both. And of course, a lot of traditionalists won't want to do that. They'll just want to criticize Pope Francis, but not Trent. To whatever extent, you know, respectively, Trent and then Amoris Laetitia endorse that. You know, Trent is much less, but you're reminding me, I hadn't heard that since about 2016. Yeah, Yeah, Trent
That's
didn't actively advocate for it. It just did not condemn it either. It just kind of decided, all right, let's not deal with this issue right now. So, I mean, nobody could pull out the canons that pertain to the indissolubility of marriage and actually apply it to the case of economia when it comes to divorce and remarriage. And again, if somebody is going to be scandalized by Amoris Laetitia, like I was, back in 2016, you're going to end up being scandalized when you find the same problems there in Eastern Orthodoxy. I mean, moreover, I remember some of the things that I was scandalized by Pope Francis. I remember going and hearing during the Divine Liturgy at the local Greek Orthodox Church, them reading a patriarchal encyclical from Patriarch Bartholomew. And some of the things that he was saying in there, it was all about the environment, right? Sounded exactly like Pope Francis. So again, some of the things that traditionalists are very concerned about, and maybe rightly so in some cases, they feel discontent with Catholicism and they think that Orthodoxy is going to be safe haven. They're going to be really disappointed when they find out the grass isn't necessarily greener on the other side.
It's browner. I mean, that's the thing, man. Like even Soloviev, who is a kind of mystic, Orthodox Russian thinker that Dostoevsky, who hated Catholics, he's my favorite writer aside from Tolkien, but he hated Catholics. But he idolized Soloviev, and Soloviev was a good influence to the extent that he was an influence on Dostoevsky. He said, look, and Bulgakov repeated this in Vatican I, who was an Orthodox thinker witnessing the events and the debates of the council there. You can't get the autocephalous brothers, for extending an analogy here, the 14 or whatever autocephalous brothers to table unless Papa calls them there. So you need a pope to have the kind of universal jurisdiction that we're arguing over. And if you don't have that universal jurisdiction, then sorry, EO guys, I know it's trendier. I know it's less errant than Protestantism, but it's kind of just Protestantism without universal jurisdiction, which is why res ipsa loquitur.
Yeah.
Sorry, say that again, Michael.
Oh, I was just saying sacramental Protestantism.
Yeah, it's sacramental, episcopal, ecclesial Protestantism. That's what it is. You need, I mean, because they truckled after the 1930 Lambeth Conference to the forces of artificial contraception, just as the Protestants did, right? It was there's a Lambeth Conference like every decade for 3 or 4 tries, 1900, 1910, 1920, 1930. And I think it was after 1930 that both a bunch of the EOs, take your pick depending on the bishop, and most of the Protestant sects truckled, right? They gave in after 1930 years of Eastern Orthodoxy and whatever that is, 400 years of the Protestant religion. They gave in, right? That was the first time ever, 1930, that any Christian had that, wasn't it?
Yeah, to my knowledge, prior to then, I don't know of any Orthodox bishop or synod accepting contraception. So I would say it had to have been afterwards. I don't know of any prior to that. Now, they had already folded on divorce and remarriage going back to the first millennium in some cases, right? But as far as contraception, yeah, that was a pretty recent innovation. And then they started folding on some other things as well after that.
So I'm just curious, what do you call yourself? Because I'm not like a labeler guy. I call myself Roman Catholic. And
right.
This was part of my issue. People are all saying, well, how do you brand yourself? When I started Rules for Retrogrades, I'm like, branding's gay. I don't brand myself. I'm just a Roman Catholic. That's good enough. But people all want to know, like, I'm a Latin Mass Catholic. Any week I can during COVID, the last 15 months, I'll tell you this much. I basically lived the way the SSPX were advising their people to live. Just go to Latin Mass when you can. The nearest one to me is about 100 miles, New Orleans. And that's what I was doing. That's how I was living. I'd bring my family once every 4 or 5 or 3 or 6 weeks, whatever it was in that time, depending on what I had going on, because of the dispensation we all had. I have a boomer Novus Ordo 90 seconds from my house. This Sunday was the first time we'd gone in 15 months, actually, since I moved to Mississippi. And so, yeah, I am Latin Mass all the way. There is no question. I'm not one of these guys that tries to say, the Novus Ordos can be done as well. No, But that's a discipline, and we're going to talk about Vatican II. We keep promising and not getting to it. That's a discipline, right? I'm a TLM Catholic. I don't call myself trad anymore for the precise reason that basically everyone besides me, I started noticing when I was calling myself a trad, claims that there's this, whether they admit it or not, this problem of indefectibility in the church, which is one of its primary precepts. It has to be indefectible. And they just have all of these sort of dressed up lies or misconceptions that go about, namely that Vatican II was the only out of 21 ecumenical councils that was pastoral, non-dogmatic. Not right. Lateran 1, 2, and 3 all are as well. And it's a bunch of just misconceptions, maybe sort of higher information misconceptions. Nevertheless, what do you call yourself?
It's a pretty tough one to answer. I mean, because there's a lot of nuances that I would maintain. So it's very hard to fit me in any one category. To a traditional Catholic, I'm going to sound non-traditional. To a non-traditional, I'm going to sound traditional. To a Latin Rite, I'm going to sound Eastern Catholic. To an Eastern Catholic, I'm going to sound Latin. I have a lot of nuances and some things that I could appreciate from the Eastern Catholics. Let's put it this way. If there were a Latin Mass nearby, there unfortunately aren't. I'm in Monroe, Louisiana. There's nothing. The closest one is New Orleans. If there were a Latin Mass nearby, I would go there over the local Novus Ordo for sure. Yeah. I only have a Novus Ordo that's it's good as far as Novus Ordos go. It's very high liturgy, but it's still not the Latin Mass, right? Yeah. I would go to a Latin Mass over that if I had the option. That being said, I would still say that there was a need to reform some of the things from the Latin Mass, which the Council Fathers themselves recognized. But the problem is the implementation of it was a nightmare. It was not done right at all. But again, there's a fundamental difference between, Sacrosanctum Concilium and then the actual, Concilium of Bugnini and all the implementations afterwards, and then the abuses and all that.
But are you yeah. And again, this is discipline. One can actually afford to reasonably disagree or differ or not really even talk about a discipline. I mean, the Pope with universal jurisdiction could tomorrow order every religious in the world to wear the tonsure. And at the same time, then this is one of the nuances that I'm not trying to sound like an academic now. We're both working on doctorates, but people out there, maybe on the internet, they don't have the time or the patience to work through. It's kind of a paradox, right? That a Pope could order everyone in the world, all the priests, to wear the tonsure tomorrow, and the next Pope could call that off the day after if theoretically that first Pope died and the second Pope could be elected in one day. He could call it off, and there's no contradiction. That's the nature of discipline. One Pope can't bind another to discipline, and one Pope can't bind another one to an aesthetically, I think, almost objectively superior Mass like the TLM versus the Novus. But the point is this, ain't it? The only problem, I mean, this is where you'll get the trads mad at you. This is where they're mad at me. There are probably some in chat right now that are mad. That's what they are. Is the big problem from Vatican II was indeed the Mass. And they love, kind of giving themselves elbow room, taking a big breath, getting ready to speak and saying, oh, that's just the tip of the iceberg. It's really not. It's really not. I mean, all of the ecumenism that's imputed there, that's spirit of Vatican II stuff. That was brought in afterwards. And most often what I hear from traditionalists is a pure ignorance on what the Syllabus of Errors, paragraph 22, promulgated by Pope Pius IX, the trads tend to love it, but they forget that there's paragraph 22, what it calls us to. It says, here's a condemned way of thinking, that I will be faithful only to extraordinary magisterium. I will not be faithful to ordinary or authentic magisterium. That's precisely what the teaching is if you say anything other than pretty much what you or I say about Vatican II. I don't trust what was going on. I don't trust the events. I do think there was bad intent, but the documents are all clean and clear. If you say anything besides that, and I don't care for the new Mass, and I try not to go.
Right.
Say anything besides that, you're in trouble. You're violating paragraph 22 of the Syllabus of Errors.
Yeah, and it's interesting you brought up Pius IX because he was dealing with some German bishops when he said that the German bishops they personally were not trying to deny any teaching authority than the extraordinary magisterium, but they had effectively only mentioned assent to it. So he goes to correct them and said, no, assent is also needed to the ordinary and universal magisterium. He calls it ordinary at the time. So it's a good point that you're missing, because a lot of traditional Catholics are just going to think, unless it's a solemn definition, I don't have any kind of assent that's owed to it. And this is just condemned in the preconciliar era. Every manualist would have rebuked you. There are manualists that would even say it's a mortal sin to go against the authentic ordinary magisterium of the church. And so a whole lot can be said there. Yeah, I would agree with you. Now, as far as the Mass too, popes can make errors when it comes to matters of prudence. Even Donum Veritatis says that, and this is a magisterial document in the post-conciliar era. Donum Veritatis notes that individual decisions on part, of a pope could be subject to error. It does also note that he couldn't perpetually err, however, in his prudential decisions. And I think that's where some traditionalists go too far, because they will rightly note, okay, some errors have been made in the post-conciliar era as far as prudence when it comes to the liturgy. I think allowing for women lectors and women altar servers is one of them. That's my personal opinion. But the idea of perpetually erring over and over and over and over and over in its prudential decisions, no, that's what's now excluded.
Ain't the term habitually, Michael?
Yes.
Is it perpetually or habitually?
Perpetually, habitually, you'll find both terms. Another thing is you'll see, and this is in the manualists, the preconciliar manualists, they generally tend to have the view that there is a safety, not necessarily infallibility, to everything that the Pope and the magisterium teaches, but there's generally a safety to them. In other words, even if something they say isn't true in its non-definitive teachings, there's still a safety. It wouldn't condemn me to hell to believe it. Yeah. But those who want to say, well, the Ecumenical Council, the Second Vatican Council is teaching heresy and things like that, if you believe that would condemn you to hell. If you have the idea that the Second Vatican Council taught heresy, and I'm now going to assent to this error. Yeah. Well, assenting to heresy would condemn you to hell. So that would then no longer be in accord with what the manualists are saying, where there still needs to be this idea that you believe there's still a safety to its teachings.
Can we go through a few of the oft screamed on Twitter or Facebook fake corrections that trads will throw at Vatican II, from the magisterium of mom's basement or whatever, or Facebook or whatever. I mean, and we've all done it. We all do it on Twitter. So
I've been guilty of
like some big pot shot. It's just, these are like fake. It's when you're gonna, you're gonna actually someone, you better have your actually correct. And the problem is, for those of us who actually go and look into these things, you, I'm sure, and I know, have actually incorrectly, and a lot of the trads out there have. So it doesn't have to be fighting words. It just has to be, look, facts are facts. And here's the thing. So first off, I just want to get your take. If we could go through,
sure.
I say one word or something, and maybe one or two words, and you tell me, what the trads are out there saying, and here's the correction. You mentioned LG 14. I just wanted to read that puppy, if that's cool. And I have
absolutely.
Thank you. I'll thank you.
I think that'd be helpful.
Yeah.
It actually says some things there in Lumen Gentium 14 that you would think Vatican II would have never said. It has some very strong language in there.
Oh, it's so traditional. Okay, take this. When Bishop Robert Barron was talking to Ben Shapiro,
right.
The latter asked the former, hey, do I need to convert?
Right.
The whole world just watched, the whole Catholic world who watched that was just flabbergasted that he didn't take such a beautiful opportunity to say, yes, you absolutely need to convert. And Ben, let me tell you, Vatican II affirms this. Lumen Gentium 14 This is what it reads. Imagine if he just read this. Well, I'm not going to answer. I'm uncomfortable. I'm Bishop Barron. I'm Mr. Nice Guy to non-Christians or whatever. Not so much to those of us on the traditional leaning right, but what if he just said, I'm going to read you Lumen Gentium 14, and I don't want to say more than that. That would have been a much better answer than, well, Christianity is the privileged path, meaning implying
Right.
that there are other paths. What if he just said, quote, this sacred council wishes to turn its attention firstly to the Catholic faithful, basing itself upon sacred scripture and tradition. It teaches that the church, this is Vatican II, Lumen Gentium, the church now sojourning on earth as an exile is necessary for salvation.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't say that. Point number one, whiff number one, Bishop Barron. Christ present in his body to us, which is the church, is the one mediator and the unique way of salvation. Unique means only, baby. That's number two. In explicit terms, he himself affirmed the necessity of faith and baptism. That's point number three, citing Mark's gospel and the Gospel of John. And thereby affirmed also the necessity of the church. Point number four, through baptism as through a door, people enter the church. And point number five, whosoever, therefore, this is where it comes to the point would have answered Shapiro's question. Whosoever, therefore, knowing that the Catholic Church was made necessary by Christ, would refuse to enter or to remain in it, could not be saved. You already cited that. Wouldn't that have been
a whole lot better than what we got? Sure.
Wouldn't have been the best? I mean, that's like as trad as you can get, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I recognize that, Pius IX and others, Pius XII, speak about, very, very exclusive cases where somebody could be joined to the church in an extraordinary way. If they're invincibly ignorant, they're infused with the theological virtue, blah, 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 blah. I understand that. The problem is the focus that Lumen Gentium has, especially if you look at the very end of paragraph 16, it assumes that the vast majority of people are not invincibly ignorant. It assumes the vast majority of people are following Satan. It assumes the vast majority of people are not following their conscience. They're trading the good for evil. They're doing bad, not the good. It assumes that. And so the problem is, when you have guys like Bishop Barron and they go and talk to, people like Shapiro, they're assuming, well, Shapiro, you're probably invincibly ignorant and you're doing the best that you can. But Lumen Gentium doesn't afford you that assumption.
Right.
Lumen Gentium wants to say, no, often it is the case. Most people are deceived by Satan and blah, 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 blah. So it has a disposition of assuming that a person is in danger. And so therefore we need to make the gospel known to them. And that's what we should have done there in that interview, is tell them of the necessity of joining the church rather than assuming something that only God could know in very extraordinary cases. So that was my concern with what happened with Barron. Not so much that it's not true that Christ is the privileged path in a very qualified sense, that's true, but you're giving the impression that it doesn't really matter. You're giving the impression that there are other ways to Christ and there aren't. You're giving the impression that there are that you could maybe be saved through the old covenant or something, and that's not the case. So my concern there was especially the disposition in Vatican II, and especially in Lumen Gentium, doesn't afford this attitude of, let's just assume they're invincibly ignorant and we can just talk about Christ being the privileged way and we don't have to say anything else. No, that's not what Lumen Gentium says.
Famed Supreme Court jurist Oliver Wendell Holmes said, and he's a nominalist among other things, a relativist, determinist. He famously says, under the sun, no distinction of kind exists. They're all distinctions of degree. Now, he's not right, but in the sense that we're talking here, it seems true enough that technically speaking, to any of these theological questions, like the one that Shapiro asked Bishop Barron, he could have given the Reverend Lovejoy answer, which is this: short answer, no with a but; longer answer, yes with an if. Sure, he could have done that, but overall, there's a thrust to an answer, and that answer is, certainly whiffed, right? And it whiffed for the reasons that you enumerated. That it's like, well, I mean, Aquinas, Bellarmine, Vatican I, all presumed things like a baptism by desire or invincible ignorance at higher levels of ignorance. So that's true, but shouldn't he just have read him Lumen Gentium 14?
I think that would have been way better, because we're nowhere commissioned to go and make people feel good about where they're at. We are, however, commissioned to go out and preach the gospel, tell people to repent and join the church. We are commissioned to do that. So that would have been a perfect opportunity. The guy's straight up asking you, hey, please tell me, do I need to embrace the gospel? I mean, he opened the door for you.
Yeah, no, he did. I mean, and Shapiro's a smart dude, you know, few out there agree with him or anyone for that matter on everything, but he's a smart dude. He's got a steel trap brain and he could handle it. And what's he always saying? Facts don't care about your feelings. Like what? Okay. So why couldn't Barron just have been like, well, here's Lumen Gentium 14.
There's a charitable way he could have done that. He doesn't have to be a jerk or anything. He could have done it in a charitable way. You can speak the truth in love. It's possible to do both, but I think that we're commanded to do both. We can't just pass on it. And here's my criticism. My criticism isn't of Vatican II and Lumen Gentium here. My criticism is people's understanding of what Lumen Gentium is doing here. That's my criticism. This idea that I can assume ignorance and I can assume that people are this exceptional case. Whereas the vast majority of history, the assumption was elsewhere. So the disposition of the church has generally been to assume culpability and invincibility, and therefore to preach the gospel. And I think we need to maintain that in the post-conciliar era. I don't believe Lumen Gentium overturned that.
No.
It was just simply explaining what had already been said in the pre-conciliar era. There's nothing that Lumen Gentium says at all, 14 through 16, nothing that it says that wasn't already said by previous popes and theologians. So it's just repeating what has been said. I think the problem is in the post-conciliar era, we just, our disposition changed. And I think we saw it there with Bishop Barron.
Yeah, and we saw it with the bishop, the muscle of the episcopate and the periti at the council. Now, their intention could have been bad. They could have been like, now we can play on this spirit for the first time in 20 Christian centuries that will interpret the diabolic way, the way of Satan. Hey, we can just do whatever we want. But the teaching was always the same. And unless the teaching is abrogated, which Lumen Gentium doesn't do, then you can't blame the documents. But you can say, okay, and then this is why I do say, all right, well, the bishops there are a lot of libs there. There's a spirit of Vatican II that was playing on the weaponized ambiguity in the documents, which might have been left open even at the time. Maybe so, but a textualist looks at those documents and says, even if there is bad intent going into it, we're still reading the document as they would have the meaning, the original public meaning at the time required. And that's why guys like you and I end up defending those documents. How about with all the imputed ecumenism to the council, and really a lot of the libs who are running the council, again, I think wanted this. What about the Muslims? What about the Buddhists? What can you say a word on? I mean, I want to do like an associational word. Why does Vatican II not err on the Muslims and the Buddhists? Go.
Yeah, a lot could be said there. And you're right, there sometimes is a little bit of ambiguity, but of course we have that with Nicaea I, and we also have that with Chalcedon and some other of the councils. And some of it was deliberate, by the way, in those councils. So if we're going to criticize Vatican II for it, okay, that's fine. But just remember, we need to criticize these other councils. Nicaea I, we need to criticize Ephesus and Chalcedon and a few others as well who kind of have some deliberate ambiguity. I can also mention some cases in Trent where we see that. Yeah, okay. But talking about why it does not err here in this particular case, when it comes to Jews and Muslims, the language they are used in Lumen Gentium, it's very carefully constructed. It talks about those who are related to us. It doesn't say those who are us. There's some nuances there. It talks about those who are related to us. It also talks about God's possibility of salvation does not exclude this group. It doesn't say that they are, it's just saying it doesn't exclude them. And of course, yes, we know God's possibility or his grace for salvation is available to all. So it's not saying that they are saved. It's saying his grace is not withheld from them. So you'll see this in relation to Jews, Muslims, and atheists. It's not actually saying that they're saved. What it's saying is God's grace is available to them. And by the way, it nowhere says in Vatican II they would not have to come to an explicit profession of faith.
Right.
It never excludes that view. You could maybe read it and say, okay, well, maybe they don't have to come to an explicit profession of faith. Maybe through invincible ignorance, they could have an implicit faith. One could maintain some of those arguments, but it's nowhere excluded the idea that they would have to come to an explicit knowledge of the Trinity and the incarnation and would have to make a profession of faith and so on. So if you look at the language used, and in fact, I've done entire shows where I go literally through every single line and explain it. Yeah. If you look at all of the language used, it's not saying, oh, well, Jews are okay, Muslims are okay, atheists go to heaven. That's not what it's saying. Only a hermeneutic of rupture would read that into the text, and we're not allowed to do that. We have to read the text in light of tradition in the same way that we read Chalcedon in light of tradition and don't read Chalcedon as an historian, which is what some people were doing after Chalcedon. They started saying Chalcedon's guilty of Nestorianism. And that's one of the reasons why we had to have the Fifth Ecumenical Council. They were reading Chalcedon in a heretical fashion, but we had to say, no. You need to read Chalcedon in light of the tradition, in light of what has been preached, in light of what the saints have said. We got to do the same thing for Lumen Gentium if we're going to be consistent. If we did it for Chalcedon, got to do the same thing for Vatican II.
Okay, but here's the thing. It's a fake but. Nostra Aetate, they say doesn't, I feel lame doing this because I know what the easy save answer is. Right. Nostra Aetate, doesn't it say Buddhists get to reach nirvana and enlightenment?
No, it does not. It does not actually say that.
What does it say?
What it says is they teach.
They believe.
They teach that they are able to obtain a connection or a union with God through their own efforts or through blah, blah, blah. They teach. It nowhere says that they actually attain it. It nowhere says that God's grace is no longer needed, and now the council is guilty of Pelagianism or something. I condemned heresy at the time of Vatican II. The fathers weren't idiots. Even the most liberal Paridi there would not have gone against the canon there in Trent in session 6 that would condemn Pelagianism. So they're not idiots.
Look, my crazy Uncle Remus believed that he could fly by flapping his arms really, really hard. And he plummeted to his death off of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. I'll make that up. No, I don't have I mean, like you can report the errant views of others, right? My crazy Uncle Remus believes he can fly. He teaches, and he taught his weirdo disciples. Let's expand this our hypothetical further, right? Yeah. He taught disciples that he could fly by flapping his arms really hard. That's all it says. I mean, go check.
But you know what else it says? You know what else? It quotes John 14:6, which is, of course, all about the exclusivity of salvation in Christ alone. And there's salvation in no one. He's the way, the truth, the life. It actually quotes John 14:6 there, Nostra Aetate. And of course, the idea when it comes to interpreting the council is that you interpret some of these other smaller documents in light of the larger ones, namely Lumen Gentium and Sacrosanctum Concilium and Dei Verbum. So you would read Nostra Aetate in light of Lumen Gentium 14, which you had already read, which talked about Christ being necessary, the only way to salvation, baptism being necessary, the church being necessary. You would read Nostra Aetate in light of that.
Of course.
So if somebody were to just really be honest and look at Nostra Aetate, they can't attribute heresy to it. They can't even attribute error to it. There's no error there. Even if we're not saying it's not heretical, it's just wrong, you can't even say that it's wrong. No. That's not even there.
No. I mean, again, you and I don't have to agree on this. Maybe we do, maybe we don't. Who cares? I happen to believe that the heteropraxy of Sacrosanctum Concilium and the ambiguity of some of the other documents in a more limited way was weaponized or codified, whatever, who cares? The only point is that there aren't errors in the document. What about, if we're going Nostra Aetate, Lumen Gentium, what about what the council teaches in its documents on the Muslims? I'll let you get to knock all these out of the park. I'm just playing straight man here.
Well, I mean, a lot of people are up in arms about its talk about together with us, they adore the one God, but it should be noted that popes and even theologians, you can even see this in the Catholic Encyclopedia, which I know is, it's not infallible or anything, but you can see that this was commonly taught in the preconciliar era by looking and seeing that it's in the Catholic Encyclopedia, the old one. You'll see it saying the same thing. In fact, you have John of Damascus way back in the day when Islam started, just simply calling Islam a Christian heresy. Now, I think at that time, maybe it was a Christian heresy. I think there's been some developments in Islam that actually make it no longer a Christian heresy. It's its own religion now.
Yeah.
But at that time, that was true. But you can still see this disposition that, yes, they adore the one God, but falsely, not salvifically. And that's how we are to understand Lumen Gentium here. They adore the one God, but they don't, it doesn't do anything. It's number one, they misunderstand who that one God is. And it's not salvific, number two. It's not done in grace. The same thing can be said of Jews. I mean, let's ask the question, do the Jews adore the one God? Yes and no, just like the Muslims. Yes, insofar as they are aimed at the one God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Do they actually reach, salvifically an honoring worship of that one God? No, because if they did, they wouldn't be denying the Trinity. And they would also already be receiving God's grace, which ordinarily comes through the sacraments, which they lack.
Yeah, look, so, let me do you one better. The Protestants, do they worship Jesus, the only place he ordinarily exists on planet Earth anymore, in the presence of the Eucharist? No. Mm-hmm. Are they still Christian? Now, they are still Trinitarian, mm-hmm. and the Jews and the Muslims are not. But let me back you up. Let's stick to Muslim specific.
Yeah.
Are they one of the three Abrahamic faiths, the Muslims? And the answer in the bimillennial Catholic tradition has been yes. Let's start with Pope Gregory the Seventh, mm-hmm. a high medieval pope. He calls them worshipers of the one true God. Right. How about Bellarmine? He calls them worshipers of the one true God. One true God. It just means that they're one of the Abrahamic faiths. Duh, I learned this in like fourth grade. What about the Pius X Catechism?
Yeah.
Says that they're worshipers of the one true God. Vatican II, in these two documents, only says that Muslims worship the one God. It doesn't make it worse if they say the one true God. Right. But I believe Taylor Marshall he added the word true, which would have actually, and he was bemoaning it, but this would just make Vatican II only as bad as the Pius X Catechism, which is, don't they have a society there for Pius X that takes the namesake? Or Gregory the Seventh, the faithful Pope, or Bellarmine? But Vatican II, why did you make all this up? Why did you make up that the Muslims are one of the three Abrahamic faiths? Why did you do this, James Madison? Is a joke my producer and I have. The point is, the Vatican might have had a fruitier attitude about ecumenism, particularly in the spirit of the council that they knew would kick off in the late 60s and 70s. Who cares? That's not the point. The council documents in either of these, Nostra Aetate, Lumen Gentium, doesn't say anything novel. It doesn't even say anything interesting. And so I want to run through this because we're just dropping science, cold science here. I'd like to be able to get to a couple questions. Do you want to do that? Do you have time to do that, Michael?
Yeah, absolutely.
Would you just make a 30-second closing statement on why this is a matter of indefectibility? You addressed, I guess, Taylor Marshall in one of your recent videos on, the problem with having a problem doctrinally with Vatican II is the problem of, are you jeopardizing the indefectibility of the church? Would you just knock it out of the park? Then we'll go to some questions.
Yeah, I mean, the church's teaching authority, even whenever the church is not speaking ex cathedra or solemn definition, there's still a general protection given to it. So it's never going to teach heresy. You might say it doesn't teach things as well as it should have in lower level cases. Okay, that's fine. But you can never attribute heresy to it. And it's rooted in the promise that he who hears you hears me, and the Holy Spirit will lead you into all truth. You can see preconciliar popes applying that to the papal teachings, and they're not talking about ex cathedra teachings. You can also see this in the post-conciliar era where popes are confirming this, and they're not even talking about ex cathedra. They're talking about in its general papal teachings, or even an ecumenical council when it teaches non-solemnly. So I think what ends up happening is you end up undermining the teaching authority itself and the promises that are given to it when you ascribe heresy to an ecumenical council.
Yeah, authentic ordinary magisterium. Right. It's a bore to go through it all, but it is all worked out. And by the way, before people start acting up in the comm box or the chat,
Rioting.
the same rioting if you're in Minneapolis or whatever, because it's evidently it's legal there. I've learned over 2020 and 2021. No, papal encyclicals like Amoris Laetitia, you kind of figured this out, Michael, the hard way. They don't have the same, they don't have nearly so much gloss. They don't have
Sure.
nearly so much protection by the Holy Spirit. So
Sure.
they have to be habitually, perpetually repeated or whatever, right? So boom, people ask us questions, but please don't bring that up. Encyclicals, it has to be repeated a number of times before it's truly magisterialized and protected. The way in Casti Connubii, that gives the stamp. There have been, I don't know what the magic number is. Does an encyclical have to say it 5 times before it goes up into the magisterium or should be brought into the AAS? I don't know what the magic number is, but it's not just Francis writing Laudato Si, about how plants are like our mother or whatever. That's him trying his hand at that. No other pope's ever written on that. So it's not magisterialized, not in the way that really matters, and not in the way that would jeopardize the indefectibility of the church were it to be incorrect. So while we're waiting for a question, people, Thursday is the first class. Go to timothyjgordon.com and click enroll. The first new class period in 2 new classes, the new late spring semester on church history, and the rules for retrograde short 10-week course on right-wing community organizing. Do we have a question for Michael? We have lots.
We have a super chat question, and we have somebody asking you to explain more about invincible ignorance.
Okay, that's super chat. Michael, you want to knock that out fast?
Yeah, a whole lot that can be said here. And this especially came around with the discovery of the New World. Theologians had to really start wrestling around with this, although you can see it still implicitly taught in the first millennium and even in scripture itself by Jesus. But the term invincible ignorance applies to the concept that God is not going to hold somebody culpable for something that they don't know if they could not have known it. If it wouldn't have been reasonably possible for them to have known something, he's not going to hold them accountable for it. That's invincible ignorance, as opposed to vincible ignorance, which is I don't know about something, but I could easily do a Google search and find out in 10 seconds, right? I'm still accountable for not knowing that information, even since it was extremely easy for me to dispel that ignorance. So that's all invincible ignorance is. It doesn't mean just because somebody is invincibly ignorant that they're saved. It just means they're not going to be condemned for what they don't know. That's all it means.
That's very good.
Next question, Tim, can you and Marshall debate this publicly?
Well, that doesn't rest with me, friends. I'm a debater. I did 4 or 5 debates in the last 13 or 14 months alone against really good debaters. Chris Farrar has agreed to come on my show and debate some of, does error have rights? Particularly in light of the fact that he defended the rights of Jews to go back to synagogue and won it, First Amendment rights. So we'll be doing that soon. I'd love to have Marshall on the show. We were former partners or whatever, co-hosts, and I'd absolutely love to. Doesn't seem to be possible. I don't think Marshall does the debate or really even the dialogue if you're disagreeing much at all. There is a show, and I'd love to do it. That's not, my tongue is not in my cheek, but there is a show, which one of the last shows we ever did in October of 2019 on the hermeneutic of continuity. And we're coming as close to debate as Marshall ever comes. He's not a public debater. And for whatever reason, he won't return the offer to debate, or really even a call between you, me, and the wall. But so the point is, I'd love to.
Let's see here. Would you say Amoris Laetitia is not technically incorrect?
That for me or you?
Yeah.
It's a rough one because, like I said, that was one of the main things that scandalized me to go and look into Eastern Orthodoxy. Very technically speaking, you could read it in an Orthodox sense, but I think that's part of the problem. We need more than just reading it in an Orthodox sense. We do need the magisterium to be firm and clear on some things and not just give us bare bones. Technically, this is Orthodox. We need more than that. The magisterium is supposed to really guard the deposit of faith a little bit more carefully than that. So I don't think anybody could technically ascribe heresy to it. That's my opinion. Somebody might think otherwise, and we can have that discussion. But Did it say everything that it needed to say to properly guard against misunderstanding? No.
Well, the problem is the letter by the Argentine bishops.
Right.
We don't have to agree on this. I don't know about heresy because that's a different standard, but I do think it's error, and it's a post-synodal apostolic exhortation. No big deal. The problem, the interesting thing to sort out later, I don't think this throws indefectibility into any kind of jeopardy, but is the fact that 6 months later, the letter from the Argentine bishops was stuck into the AAS. That's not stuck into anyone's ASS, so don't DM me later. They stuck it up the AAS, and that's the Acta Apostolicae Sedis. That's a problem. So, but it's not the kind of problem we're talking about if Vatican II had said something like this, or an ecumenical council,
fundamentally different,
one of the pastoral ones. It is a problem, and it's going to have to be dealt with later, but it's not the same level of problem. It's an even lower potential magisterial document than an encyclical. It's an exhortation. So,
and even with it just going into that, that generally makes it magisterial whenever it's teaching, but an interpretation isn't necessarily, technically speaking, teaching. So the fact that it entered the AAS doesn't even necessarily make it magisterial as far as
enter my AAS. I'll tell you that. Not on my radar, not in my backyard. No, but so here's the thing,
one could still say, like you're saying, that it's erroneous, and yet that's not the same thing as attributing heresy to an ecumenical council. Those are fundamentally different things. I think you have room for your position to argue that. No one has room to ascribe heresy to an ecumenical council.
No, that's too far. That's the only answer that matters. Like, that's okay. Everything else is above our pay grade. Not in like a, no offense, Catholic Answers way, where you're kicking the ball down the road and being a smokescreen patriot. No. I mean, literally, like, it's not a problem for the faith. It's probably a problem for all the bishops trying to push this stuff. Yeah. But I will say, pretty much all, if you go through that infamous footnote, the only repeatable, weekly sacraments that could possibly apply would be communion. So I would say, by force of elimination, you would have to say that even the footnote, even though they're trying to do the weaponized ambiguity thing on steroids, you'd have to say this is communion. But again, the correct answer is, who cares? Unless I'm Francis, who did this. He's going to have serious punishment to pay, or the Argentine bishops that are pushing it. Who cares? If you're divorced and civilly remarried, do not receive communion. It is the answer, because the binding and loosing of post-synodal apostolic exhortation is unclear. That's the real answer. Just leave it.
Next question: Can Vatican II's teaching on non-Catholics receiving communion be defended? Also, OC 27 states that some people are separated from the church in good faith. I believe I don't know how to say that.
What was the first half, Michael? You can.
Yeah, reception of communion for non-Catholics. Well, of course, this actually was something there in the preconciliar era as well. So, very technically speaking, it was allowed. Although I would say that Vatican II broadened its permissibility, and it was especially broadened afterwards, after Vatican II. Yeah, very very technically speaking, it's allowed. I mean, for example, in cases of death in the preconciliar era, somebody's dying, they're Orthodox or something, and all they have is a Catholic nearby, they could have been given Holy Communion in those cases. Now it's been broadened in cases of Eastern Orthodox, not in case of death. So they're not about to die, but they ask for it and they don't have a Orthodox minister nearby. It does allow for communion for them. That would be a prudential decision. That would definitely fall under prudence. Yeah, it's not under teaching,
Yeah, and it's not what the German bishops are pushing for. When you say intercommunion, you're hearing Walter Brandmuller warning about the fourth goal of the Sankt Gallen Mafia. First, basically, Amoris Laetitia, then women deacons, then abolish priestly celibacy, and then intercommunion with the Lutherans. No. This is a much bigger, more atomic deal if you're trying to do this with people that aren't in any sense of the ecclesiae.
Yeah. No, it was very guarded what Vatican II is doing, as opposed to this indiscriminate idea of just communion for everybody.
We have another super chat question. Was Cardinal Bugnini really a Freemason, or is that just dumb trad propaganda?
He wasn't a cardinal, but he might have Freemason connections. It's hard to know ever. People don't tend to wear it so much.
There was speculation that he was, but there hasn't been any concrete evidence that has surfaced, to my knowledge, that would actually substantiate that claim. That being said, you don't need that claim to say that some of the things he suggested in the conciliar reform weren't good. I don't have to call him a Freemason to say this is a really bad idea, which you're proposing here to Paul VI.
Right.
So,
you can't say that the ideas aren't concomitant with Masonic ideas. The ideals were, parallel with Masonic ideals. And I know I've heard all the stories too. The problem is evidencing them. Even if one goes to a less ambitious claim about what Skilabix said about we know what we're going to do after the council.
Right.
The only place I can source that? Lefebvre's book. Right. And I'm like, I believe that Skilabix would say that he's a scumbag. Right. I believe that. I am inclined to believe Lefebvre about that. But the point is, I'm not sure. You'd like to see it in writing by Skilabix himself.
In fact, I'm going to be doing a show on that because we traced it down. We found it. The thing, however, is when you actually look at it in its original language, it does take away from some of the force as the translation. So even though it's still bad, it's not as bad as people make it sound out to be. Moreover, as you noted, he's really the only one who has ever said that. So this idea that there's just this constant weaponized ambiguity laced through the text, I don't take that view. I would say that it's there. It's just not this constant theme of it's all over the place. There's ticking time bombs everywhere. And they were just everybody, all these Pariti were just waiting for Vatican II to get over so that they could exploit it. There's a grain of truth to it, but I think people end up blowing it out of proportion and making it to be more than it is when you start to really look for sources.
Yeah, I'd say, again, I'd say reasonable disagreement. I wouldn't be flabbergasted or devastated if I were wrong, but I would say the evidence of the weaponized ambiguity doesn't ever require even one admission. You're saying you found it out of the mouths or the pen of Skilabix. I'd be interested in that, but it doesn't require even one for there to be lots of instances of it. I always call it binder drop theory. I do think you see it with the mass. If a substitute teacher is teaching a class and at 2:57 p.m. before the bell rings, every kid in the class drops his binder all at once. The same way you have all these bizarre, disgusting abuses at pretty much 99% of all the Novus Ordos in the world. And none of them appear in the document. You'd assume there's an email or whatever the hell they sent around back in the day, a proto email saying, let's do this at all. Just duh. So that would be weaponized ambiguity. We don't even need to point at weaponized ambiguity. We don't even need an admission anywhere. We don't need Cardinal Gottfried Daniels to admit that he was part of a St. Gallen mafia for it to be true. It just makes it easier to do the research later.
You're right.
That, is Skilabix, did you find that traced to Skilabix or just to Lefebvre saying Skilabix did it?
I believe it's his autobiography. I'm going to have to go back and look, but yeah, we're going to have a show on it soon. But you're right. But those cases of ambiguity, to verify them, I would want to see what does the acts of the council say? Why did they use this term as opposed to that one? And if it's to accommodate the liberals and stuff like that, then I would say, yeah, that is a case of, weaponized ambiguity. But if they had some other reason for it and it makes sense, I would say, okay, maybe this isn't the case. I would want to look at the acts though.
Gotcha. Good.
Yeah.
Another super chat question. I am EO. I believe in far more papal claims, but no ECC here. If TLM vanished and NO were it, if TLM vanished, I'd risk return to my former atheism. What about me? And sorry if I butchered your question. It seems like it was kind of.
Are they saying they're EO or
they're Eastern Orthodox, I think,
but not ECC? Did you understand that, Michael?
What he's saying is I'm Eastern Orthodox, but not really inclined to Eastern Catholicism is what it sounds like. And so he's interested in the Latin Mass, but if the Latin Mass weren't to be available, he would just end up going atheist is what he's saying.
That's real weird. Who cares what the Mass is? Look, people, you shouldn't be, recreationalizing the Mass, even if it's a less entertaining Mass. This is what the Protestants do, right? if you acknowledge that this is the one true faith, Jesus is the God man, go to his mass, even if it were 10 times uglier than the ugliest Novus Ordo. Why is that? Did I read that wrong? Michael, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that one thing I would challenge on the questioner's part is the assumption that unless there's a Latin mass, there's really nothing that he could go to. And I would challenge that. I would say one should still go to a good Novus Ordo if there's one available. If there's no Latin mass available, I would go to Latin mass first. But if there's none available, go to a good Novus Ordo. But if there are no good Novus Ordos, then your mass obligation has been dispensed. But you might want to go in, perhaps in the future, move to a location where you have something decent, right? But I wouldn't want to say it's either Latin mass or atheism. And why rule out the Eastern Catholics? I would take a second look at the Eastern Catholics. If there's only Latin mass and Eastern Catholics nearby and they take away the Latin mass, go to the Eastern Catholics. What's wrong with them?
Or yeah, I would just pipe in kind of extrinsic advice. Get a hobby. You know, I mean, like if God is God and the church is the bark, then, you know, get a hobby, start whittling from wood or play a sport or something. Go to mass, take care of your obligation, get to a Latin mass if you can. Don't worry about it. God will do the rest.
We have another super chat question, and I'm going to have to be careful on this one. So there's going to be a little bit of code. Please address trad descent to ordinary magisterium on abort-tainted Maxines. How much can we dissent from ordinary magisterium on those and IVF, etc.?
The funny thing on the Maxine is we're not so cleverly calling it here. I think we got it from Patrick Coffin is, you know, the CDF, the SSPX, pretty much all churchmen are teaching in the same direction here. You know, I'm not a big fan of Maxine. She's not a good woman, I don't think, but I mean, yeah, if the CDF and the SSPX are in agreement about something, you don't really have to take it upon yourself to act as pontiff and be stricter. They can't make you go get it, and to go get Maxine, and I don't advise that anyone does. But what do you care if they've looked into it with a much more technical, moral theological eye and said, look, this isn't formal cooperation, and it's not, whatever. Remote or proximate material cooperation. So who cares? It's boring math that you don't have to do.
So this was another question, and there's several in this question. So you, I might want to take it in part. But what anathemas did Vatican II contain, Tim? Lateran councils had plenty. What issues was Vatican II called to settle? Read Lateran councils. They're not like Vatican II.
No, there are no. Michael, back me up on this thing. Lateran IV anathematizes a couple things. There are no dogmatic definitions, which is the test of whether it's a pastoral council in 1, 2, and 3. I don't know. I'm not going to go through all 3 documents for it.
This is a perfect example where I think people are inconsistent. There are no anathemas in Florence, yet it's an ecumenical council, and none of us would reject it. Why don't we consistently apply that to Florence? There's no anathemas there. In fact, Mark of Ephesus, who's on the opposing side for the Eastern Orthodox, rejecting it, one of the criticisms he has about Florence is there's no anathemas. So you're now using an Eastern Orthodox argument against a Catholic ecumenical council when you use that. So it's not a really good argument. Now, you could say that maybe there should have been anathemas. Maybe it's not the best idea to have not had them. You could argue that, but to just dismiss Vatican II because it has no anathemas, apply that to Florence.
Yeah, good. And just go read Pius IX's Syllabus of Errors. It's paragraph 22 that you'll want to note.
Someone is saying, I'm also wondering, where does the church teach that something does not enter magisterium until it has been repeated? I've never seen that in church teaching anywhere.
Well, this is like what you're saying is what Protestants say about the sola scriptura. Where does sola scriptura ever say sola scriptura? Where does scripture ever say sola scriptura? The way that the magisterium works, we happen to have a guy that's doing his dissertation on it, is really technical. So, and I've had extended discussions with Franciscans, Mike Cirilla, about it, and he clarified some of my issues. But it's a really complex issue. It doesn't work. It's not something that you can get on Twitter. You have to study it. It's not so good. What do you think about this, Michael? It's not so good that the church hasn't streamlined what is and isn't magisterium more. I do think they should, but isn't the answer to this guy, it's not streamlined at all?
Well, I mean, I would say it has addressed some parameters, but not to my liking. So I would say we need to do a little bit deeper, but it has given us some guidelines. One thing that we might disagree on is, I would say that if it's taught on faith and morals in a papal encyclical, that it would still be part of the magisterium, though very low level, because you look at Humani Generis and Pope Pius XII says that anytime, a pope teaches something on a matter of faith and morals in a papal encyclical, it can no longer be questioned. That is among the theologians. That doesn't mean the magisterium itself couldn't question it. And it also doesn't mean that something else taught with a greater force couldn't override it. So just because something's there in a very low level papal homily or papal encyclical doesn't necessarily mean that it's irrevocable, infallible, or demands assent 100%. Not necessarily. So yeah, that's kind of my 2 cents on it. A whole lot more that could be said though.
I don't think trads like Humani Generis.
Sorry, they're kind of rolling in on this.
Yeah, well, we're gonna have to cut it off soon here.
Okay. This one, it looks like some typos at the beginning, so I'm going to read the second part of it. Will encourage understanding of a priesthood rooted in baptism versus ecclesiastical power. And I think they're asking will Vatican II on the theology of priesthood will encourage understanding of priesthood rooted in baptism versus ecclesiastical power. Do you understand that?
I don't understand it.
I get it. And what they're saying is that there's an emphasis on the priesthood of all believers. And how does that tie in with the sacramental priesthood that's exclusive for priests? Look, this idea is, first of all, there in the Bible. And second of all, there in the tradition of the fathers. This is something that we kind of lost sight of, especially in the second millennium, high Middle Ages, and that time. And there's reasons why I think we lost sight of it. Vatican II is calling us back to this tradition that is there in our faith, in our history. And it's saying that both of them are true. There is a priesthood of all believers. It's qualitatively fundamentally distinct and different from the sacramental priesthood, right? I mean, they're very two different things qualitatively, not just, one is just higher than the other. No, there's a substantial difference, but it's calling us back to the fact that we need to recognize we are a royal priesthood, as the New Testament puts it. And it calls us back to some participation on our part. And I don't think that's bad. I do think that you could abuse that. I think you could take that and abuse it and say, well, we're all priests, therefore get all these people here in the congregation to come over here and confect the Eucharist and put their hands up during the words of institution. That's when you're abusing things. But there's all kinds of things that are true that we can abuse, right? I mean, Augustine talks about abuse doesn't negate proper use. That's the same here. You can abuse things that are true.
We have one last super chat question. Florence had no anathemas. I thought it infallibly defined the need to be in communion with the Pope. I'm confused.
There's a difference between an anathema and a definition. An anathema is exactly that. At the end of a canon, they will say, let them be anathema. There's no such thing there. That's not the same thing as a definition. However, a definition is generally done in a solemn way. It's something like we decree or we define, and then they teach something solemnly. There's a difference between a definition then and an anathema. But you're now bringing up a problem, another problem, if you're going to be consistent here. Because I would say, as several have noted, and as Paul VI in his opening speech of the third session of the Second Vatican Council noted, I would say there are non-solemn, non-dogmatic definitions at Vatican II. Namely, in Lumen Gentium, they're settling the issue of the sacramentality of the episcopate. I would say that's done definitively, yet non-solemnly. And it's not dogmatic. It's what's called a secondary object of infallibility. All that is a long way to just say, Vatican II actually teaches something there infallibly, yet it's not dogma. And that's not opposed to what Paul VI was saying, that there's no solemn dogmatic definitions. That's true. So the point is, a definition is not the same as an anathema. And I would say you could even say that there are some definitions at Vatican II, just as there are at Florence. And we could maybe address, if you want, we could address the issue of, communion with the Pope being necessary for salvation, and how does that work with Vatican II, which is another thing they brought up there.
Michael Lofton, we are going to have to end the show definitively, yet non-solemnly. And on good, I'd love to have you back on, man. So, I mean,
yeah,
I hope when people listen to you talk, or when I talked about a lot of these issues with Matt Fradd, I hope they see just like, look, it's boring, it's technical. maybe, hopefully guys like you and I can enliven the issues some. But, and I'm a philosopher, you're actually working on the theology of the magisterium. So you're able to go a bit deeper. But the point is, it's boring, it's technical. Do you guys want to do, math or logic in your off time? That's what it is to get into the magisteria. The good part is, after Vatican II, even after Francis, there's one true faith. That's the good news here in the Easter season. And, it can't be hashed out on Twitter in 100 whatever amount of characters. Most people don't want to do that. So just don't weigh in unless you seriously want to get into the books. I hope they've seen that with you today, because you have a lot of the answers to a lot of these deeper questions. So thanks for joining me, man. Everyone go check out Reason and Theology and Michael and Eric.
Thank you.
Yeah, God bless you, man. Come back on soon.
You too. I'll come on anytime.
Yeah. Okay, cool. All right, peace.